Hey guys, welcome to another class of American-European relations. And today we're going to continue talking about China, and that's why you can not only see me, but you can also see Fernando, that you know him already from the previous class. And today we're going to address two different topics. First, we're going to be talking about human rights, and in the second half of the class, we're going to be talking about coronavirus, COVID-19, and how China has tackled that problem. But we're going to start with human rights. Remember that in the last class we talked about how we had to understand China and how China changed over time. And obviously human rights is still a big issue, right, Fernando?
Exactly. So to introduce a little bit the topic of human rights, it's always been a sore point for China and one of the main talking points for Western countries when referring to China. To review the spotty record of China with regards to human rights. So to start talking about human rights, I want to highlight that according to Chinese constitution, most of the basic human rights that you would expect from a Western democracy are recognized in the Chinese constitution. Mm-hmm. One of the most glaring exceptions is, ironically, the right of strike, which is not recognized in the constitution, which I'm sure Pablo finds very interesting.
Indeed, actually.
But any other rights, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, assembly, all those rights are included in the constitution, and they have been since the first constitution of the Communist government of China in 1954. When talking about the basic human rights, it's worth noting that China went from basically being a feudal state at the beginning of the 20th century. And when I'm talking about a feudal state, I mean, literally, there was an aristocracy, there was the right of, marrying several women for aristocrats, there were classes, there were everything that you would expect from an aristocracy, a feudal state. Those rights were perfectly valid in at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the most basic improvements for basic human rights in China was simply achieving equality between men and women. Like, women could be married when they were underage. They were mutilated with using the binding of the feet, and that was all abolished in the 1954 constitution by the Chinese government. Of course, by then it was mostly a leftover from an era past because of the Civil War and the Japanese occupation. But still, there were people who honestly thought that was going to be still a thing when the communists took over. Mm-hmm. So moving past that, as I said, in every constitution from the 1954 one to the 1982 one, which is the one that is valid now, that is has been modified a couple of times, they recognize the most basic human rights that you would expect. And one of the latest updates of this constitution, which was in 2004, they included even more democratic rights, even more basic rights in what was considered a wink to Western democracies. At the time, it was considered that they were just in the inevitability of a liberal world order was taking place in China. As we know, that was not to be, but it was how it was perceived. Of course, what is in paper and what is in reality is far different. It happens in every Western democracy, but even more so in China. Yeah. Another of the basic rights so one of the most basic ones that we could see has been the freedom of speech. China boasts of one of the best censorship systems in the world. They had that since the beginning, since its inception. One of the main achievements by Mao was how from top down he managed to modify the way people acted, the way people think. He truly achieved a perpetual revolution that quickly changed from a society from a post-feudal state to a communist a communist slash modern society. And he did so by using censorship, not only from the top down, as I said at the beginning, but also he created a system that people will censor themselves.
Uh-huh.
He did so first by creating 5 red classes, which were the good guys, the proletariats, the industrious classes, and then 5 black classes, which were the former landlords, the former intellectuals, the former aristocrats, and pitting those classes one against the other. Well, truly the reds against the blacks. The red classes, the 5 red classes, could have perfect right to censor, to prosecute, to abuse the black classes, which were the former golden child of the nationalist movement, and now they were the ugly ducklings, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
So, as I said, one of the most well-known facts about China is how they have an incredible censorship system that truly works. That they can reach any publication. They have done so in the past, and with the coming of the internet age, with the coming of the social media age, they've been adapting as fast as the system has been growing in a manner that is considered to be impossible in Western societies, to make sure that they always have the hand and the button to stop any kind of dissident thought. And that is one of the most interesting facts for authoritarian sympathizers outside of China. They always wonder, oh, China has such an incredible control of social media. China has such an incredible control on society. It's worth noting that that control is not so. Chinese people are as creative as the Chinese government is, and they will always find ways to talk about things that the Chinese government doesn't want them to talk, either being by using homonym phrases, using pictures, to ideograms to talk about things, as Pablo showed in a previous slide in a previous class. They would use Winnie the Pooh to talk about Xi Jinping. They would talk about random dates because they sound like a sentence that the Chinese government is trying to censorship. So while China does have a very good chokehold on the society does have independent thought and exercises them. However, it is coming increasingly difficult for society to keep up with the Chinese government control on social media, because of simply because currently the internet is basically all the infrastructure, the hardware, the software is in control of very few hands, either be companies like Twitter, Facebook, Google, or the Chinese government. Therefore, by reaching several agreements with Facebook, with Google, with Twitter, then the Chinese government does have very, very strong control on social media, on internet.
And what about religion?
Religion is another one of the big topics, especially lately. It seems like a million years ago now with the COVID crisis, but before this started, all eyes were on China because of the treatment of minorities, in particular religious minorities. It's worth noting that China is not homogeneous. They have over 50 nations. They have over 50 nationalities, nation identities in China. In that regard, China is very much like Spain, in which is considered to be a plurinational state with an union, not a federal state, but a union. And much as in Spain, China does not look very kindly on people trying to break away from that union. In fact, it's very explicitly forbidden. As we said, territorial cohesion is one of the big pillars of Chinese government. Now, with regards to freedom of religion has always been a pillar in Chinese constitutions from 1954. However, it was clear from the beginning that religion was not to be tolerated. In particular, at the beginning, it was almost all religions, but in particular, Christianism or any religion that would have a foreign authority casting doubts or casting shade on Chinese authorities. That is a big no-no. Mm-hmm. But technically, Chinese society has moved from total taboo of religion to slowly more and more and more open. In particular, regarding ancient Chinese religions like Buddhism, Confucianism, and the weird amalgamation of those religions that you could find in China. Mm-hmm. And even at late 90s, there were times that we would see that China was opening up to even Christian religion. Muslim religion has been very important in China because they have large segments of the population towards the west that are from a Muslim minority, the Uyghurs. Now, from the 2000, with the 9/11 crisis, China did crack down on Muslim minorities using United States support and using United States system of prosecuting terrorist organizations in the world by categorizing several Uyghur religious groups or religious institutions as terrorist groups. And since then, it has been cracking down very, very strongly on that population. This prosecution did reach a climax later in 2015 to 2020, in which Uyghurs are because it's still happening right now. They are being taken to camps and they are being stripped of every religious identity, every cultural identifier, and normalized in the eyes of Chinese society. There are aerial shots of Uyghur cemeteries being completely demolished, Uyghur buildings being completely demolished. Basically, what China is trying to do is trying to strip Uyghur culture of every identifier, every special thing they have, and normalize them. By normal, I mean Han, the Han nation, which is the majority of China. They're trying to assimilate Uyghurs to Hans. They have been using a lot of technology to do so, and they were using the failed terrorist attacks of the Beijing Olympics and several other incidents as an excuse to crack down on that society.
Yeah, and you were mentioning about how religion that has that connection with minorities. So if we address Hong Kong, as you were saying, this seems like ages ago, but Hong Kong, I mean, by the end of the day, responds to the same logic, right?
Correct. So as I was saying, for Chinese government, the key factor of the Chinese government is homogenization.
Yeah.
Did I say that correctly? Homogeneous. They want to make the society completely homogeneous. They want to make everything as basic and as simple to control as possible. One of these factors, one way to do that is being, one aspect of this has been the prosecution of cultural minorities such as the Uyghur, but again, another thing has been the Hong Kong crisis, which was also prominently featured in 2015 to 2018, and it was prominently featuring as well in 2019, right before the outbreak of COVID. So Hong Kong was reverted back to Chinese hands by 1999, 2000. The UK government returned Hong Kong, but they did so under certain pretenses that the government will respect Hong Kong's system, which had a weird mixture of British law, Chinese law, Western, a weird mixture of systems, a very strong identity. And Hong Kong was reverted to Chinese hands under the guise that that system would prevail. After 50 years, Hong Kong would completely assimilate it back to China, but until then, Hong Kong was supposed to keep that system. However, this hasn't lasted for more than 20 years since China, and from the beginning, China has been vying very strongly to introduce as much control as possible in the Hong Kong government. Hong Kong is referred to as a democracy by many. It is not quite so. Bear in mind, companies do get to vote in Hong Kong government. So to categorize it as a democracy would be a disservice to democracy. You would have to grade that declaration a lot. But the main point that I want to raise here is that since the return of Hong Kong to Chinese hands, China has been vying for more and more control, to the point that from 2010 onwards, it has been very open, and they have had a large degree of control. They did so mostly using economic weight. The companies, as I said, the larger companies of Hong Kong, they do get to vote, and they do get to decide in government matters. And Hong Kong companies, they can only survive if the Chinese government doesn't make their life difficult. So of course, they have been sympathizing with the Chinese government because the Chinese government did promise prosperity and welfare to those companies. But of course, Hong Kong society has not taken lightly to this decrease of rights and increase of Beijing mingling, and it reached the point that we have a weird mixture of people fighting for democracy, fighting against Chinese intervention, people even missing colonial days, people using racism as an argument against Beijing intervention. So it is hard to say it is easy to say that Hong Kong society is losing freedoms and rights as we speak, but it is also complicated to be fully supportive when they have been using such inflammatory, racist, and even pro-colonial stances from time to time. But this has been China's policy towards Hong Kong, and this policy toward Hong Kong has caused Taiwan to move farther and farther away from China, to the point that for the last couple of elections, the Nationalist Party of Taiwan, literally a party that advocates for a Taiwan identity, has been gaining support, and which really concerns China. So it is, with the crisis of COVID, it remains to see what will happen, because Hong Kong was brought to its knees economically and militarily towards the end of the protest and the beginning of the COVID crisis. And when all is said and done from this crisis, we will see what remains of Hong Kong and what happens with Hong Kong.
It's interesting how COVID is kind of changing, I mean, not changing dynamics, but affecting everything else. I mean, from economy, from internal pressure, from demonstrations in Hong Kong. But yeah, Fernando, I think this is a great overview on human rights in China. We are going to take a break now. And after the break, we're going to continue talking actually about COVID-19 and how has China handled that crisis, and how the events will take place there. So yeah, we're going to have a break. I'll see you in a minute, Fernando, and I'll see you, the rest of you, also in a minute.